Hello everyone, bringing you a video today on a relatively recently arrived item, which is a pair of Canadian combat boots. I thought this would quite well complement the video looking at the Canadian GS combat coat and GS combat trousers from the 1960s. And what we're looking at is a pair of what I believe to be, what I understand to be, Canadian Mark II combat boots. Now, Canadian combat boots for many years, the sort of initial design was used in slightly modified forms. You had the Mark I, the Mark II and the Mark III. The Mark III would be used for a very long time, I believe from the 70s right the way through until the 90s, I think the introduction of CAD-PAT. But obviously the sort of the latter use of those is outside my time frame of interest. The Mark IIs, I don't have an introduction date, so if anyone can help with that, I'd be very much appreciate that. And my understanding is it was around the late 1960s and they were used into the 1970s when the Mark III began to take over. And we're going to have a look at them in a little bit more detail now in the video. So without further ado, we'll have a look at these laid out on the blanket, have a look at the details of construction and so forth.
So these boots drew comments in a recent unboxing video. They were identified by a couple of commenters as being Canadian Air Force issue, and certainly some features would point to that. However, I believe they are Canadian Army Mark II combat boots, and we'll get into the reasons for that in the video. One I'll mention here straight off is the fact that Graham, the chap who sent them to me, mentioned or clarified that these were issued to a member of the Canadian Army who served in the late 60s, early 70s, and that's certainly when the Mark IIs date from. As far as I'm aware, they replaced the Mark I or began to replace the Mark I relatively soon after their introduction, and then were replaced by the Mark III in the 1970s. So the combat boot as a whole, obviously these are Mark IIs, but the Mark I prior to these was introduced alongside the Canadian combat uniform in the 1960s, and I believe the Mark II came along fairly soon after the Mark I, as said, and then the Mark III would come along after that. The main difference that I'm aware of between these and Mark I's is this cutout here between the eyelets, which obviously means when the boot, when you flex your foot forward, when you're moving, this just means that it's a little bit more comfortable to do that. Now, not all high leg combat boots have this, but it's a feature that was introduced and was perpetuated in the Mark III combat boots as well. We just look at these in a little bit more detail. I'll just open up. There is a marking, here we go, on this side. Just bring this round here without knocking the camera if I can, and get the light in there. You can see we have the size and made in Canada, what I believe to be store's code information there. And we also have the manufacturer under the sole here. You can see, I'll spin this round, grab, and then the size again. And this distinctive pattern of tread, very shallow distinctive pattern of tread. Now this is what prompted several people to mention that these possibly Canadian Air Force issue. This pattern of tread was dispensed with in the Mark III combat boot, but seems to have been perpetuated by the Canadian Air Force. As noted in comments, it doesn't pick up mud in the same way, so you're not as likely to tread mud into a hangar and cause FOD issues and foreign object damage. Jet engines do not like picking up bits of stones and dirt and so forth, and this is much less likely to pick up bits of stone. On top of that, aside from that positive element of this, obviously from the point of view of the Army, it doesn't provide a lot of grip. It's not really a good tread design for providing grip to the foot on a soft or slippery surface. It really doesn't provide much resistance in that regard, and that for that very reason it doesn't pick up a lot of mud and stuff, but it doesn't give you the kind of grip you need for a combat boot. So that was replaced in the Mark III, and we will have a look at Mark IIIs in a future video in their own right. In terms of construction and so forth, the Mark III is otherwise very similar, and you have this reinforcing piece at the heel here where the backstay curves in over the heel, and then obviously a single seam running down there. It's a very good design. They were very popular, the Canadian combat boots, certainly the Mark III, which brought in the improved sole, the improved tread pattern. They were quite sought after by British troops serving out in Bathurst. Those who could get hold of them, you have to remember at the time, of course, the British Army is still wearing the DMS boot, and as a result, men would go to some lengths to try and get hold of them. You can see the tongue in there. It's all stitched in, one piece of leather running up from this seam here all the way up, and a serviceable pair of combat boots. Quite a good design. As I say, Australia and Canada both introduced high leg combat boots in New Zealand as well. In the 1960s, it would take the UK itself some years more to introduce a standard issue high leg combat boot. But as I say, these are Canadian Mark IIs. The main differentiating feature between these and the Mark III is the tread pattern, and I believe the main distinguishing feature between the Mark I and these is this cutout here between the eyelets, just above the ankle there. If anyone has any further information regarding changes between the Mark I and these, I'd be interested to know. I'm hoping to pick up a pair of Mark Is at some point in the future. Whether or not I'll be able to find a pair, I don't know. But fingers crossed, the pair will turn up at some point and I'll be able to add those to the collection as well. I just need to pick up a pair of laces for these now, and they'll be sorted out. But I didn't think a lack of laces particularly detracted from looking at them in the video here. A note on the Air Force issue boots, which continued to use this tread pattern on the bottom here. They appear to have larger eyelets than these, wider eyelets. Now, I'm not quite sure what the purpose of that is. If anyone has more information on that, I'd be interested to know. But as I say, as far as I'm aware, as far as I can work out, these are Canadian Army issue Mark II combat boots. And as I say, we'll compare these two to Mark IIIs in a future video.
So there we are. I hope you found it interesting looking at those. As I say, hopefully cover other marks of these boots going forward. Certainly the Mark IIIs I already have, so they can be considered in a future video. That they're not that different from the Mark II, primarily in the sole, as mentioned. But nevertheless, hopefully a topic for a future video. If you'd like to see that and other videos on the channel, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And whether you've previously subscribed or you're newly subscribing, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the little notification button down below. That will, of course, alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as ever, a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It's greatly appreciated, as I always say. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down there as well. But that's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.